in the poem Gethsemane by Mary Oliver. She wrote, "The grass never sleeps, or the roses, nor does the lily have a secret eye that shuts until morning." Jesus said, "Wait with me," but the disciples slept. The cricket has such splendid fringe on its feet, and it sings, have you noticed, with its whole body, and heaven knows if it ever sleeps. Jesus said, "Wait with me." And maybe the stars did. Maybe the wind wound itself into a silver tree and didn't move. Maybe the lake, far away, where once he walked as on a blue pavement, lay still and waited, wide awake. Oh, the dear bodies, slumped and eye shut, that could not keep that vigil. How they must have wept, so utterly human, knowing this too must be part of the story. Oliver's poem reminds me how very human the disciples were. They couldn't resist sleep when Jesus asked them to stay awake with him while he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane during what turned out to be his last night alive. Those very human disciples, some of them, couldn't resist temptation. Judas Iscariot accepted 30 pieces of silver, as the story goes, from the chief priests of the temple as payment to betray Jesus to the authorities. The very human disciples couldn't resist fear. When Jesus was arrested, all the disciples deserted him and fled, no doubt in real fear of being arrested themselves, guilty by association with that rebel. Although Peter promised he would not abandon Jesus, Peter not only fled with the others, but when asked 3 times and thereby given the opportunity to side with Jesus 3 times, Peter denied knowing him. And the very human disciples couldn't resist grief. When Jesus was crucified, the men fled and the women stayed. These are common responses to grief: running from it or holding on. To be fair, scholar Marcus Borg comments, perhaps it was safer for women to be nearby. They were less likely to be suspected by the authorities of being dangerous subversives. Even so, he continues, in all the Gospels, women play a major role in the story of Good Friday and Easter. They witness Jesus' death. They follow his body after his death and see where he is buried. And they are the first ones to go to the tomb on Sunday and experience the news of what became Easter. Last week, I spoke about the pre-Easter Jesus and the post-Easter Jesus. Jesus' crucifixion by the Roman state and his followers' experiences immediately after his death are the turning point between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. The turning point between the religion of Jesus and the religion about Jesus. I believe there would be no Christ nor any types of Christianity if Jesus' followers had not experienced him as a living presence after his death, and as they tried to make sense of those experiences. Jesus was Jewish and understood himself as a leader of a Jewish renewal movement, one less preoccupied with purity laws and more focused on a relationship with God. Jesus consistently pointed away from himself and toward God. His message was consistently God-centered and not self-centered. I don't know for sure, but I don't think the Jewish people of his time thought that Jesus was God during his lifetime. I think people thought of him as divine after he was killed. When we are confronted with the question of whether we believe in the resurrection, it can be helpful to remember how very human Jesus and his followers were. After he was killed, his followers were in deep grief and despair. As I talked about last Sunday, the Jewish people during Jesus' lifetime were living under Roman occupation. Most people were living at a subsistence level. There was widespread poverty. The Roman occupiers regularly suppressed peasant uprisings by selling people into slavery and crucifying the leaders of rebellions. Thousands of people were crucified before and after Jesus. It was a cruel yet common way for the oppressor to deal with people who were seeking liberation. So into this environment comes Jesus, who challenged the social, religious, and economic status quo through his preaching, teaching, and practice of inclusive community. He gave people hope that things could change. He spoke and acted like a prophet, consistent with the prophets of old. And the people living in those desperate conditions needed hope. They needed change. They needed that hopey, changey stuff. Well, they needed a leader to follow. They gave their hearts to him. They believed in him. Can you imagine the intense grief that the people who loved Jesus must have experienced after his gruesome death? Can you imagine the despair? Where was their hope now? Where was their liberator? Gone. How were they to carry on? What were they to make of his death? Because a Messiah, by definition, according to scholar Reza Aslan, is not supposed to die. They're supposed to overturn the power of empire and liberate their people. Otherwise, they are not a Messiah. So Jesus' followers were confused. Aslan wrote, "The disciples faced a profound test of their faith after Jesus' death. The crucifixion marked the end of their dream of overturning the domination system. The kingdom of God would not be established on earth, as Jesus had promised. The meek and the poor would not change places with the rich and the powerful. The Roman occupation would not be overthrown. As with the followers of every other Messiah the empire had killed, there was nothing left for Jesus' disciples to do but abandon their cause, renounce their revolutionary activities, and return to their farms and villages. But then, something extraordinary happened. What exactly that something was is impossible to know. Jesus' resurrection is an exceedingly difficult topic for the historian to discuss. However, there is this nagging fact to consider. One after another of those who claim to have witnessed the risen Jesus went to their own gruesome deaths, refusing to recant their testimony. The disciples were themselves fugitives in Jerusalem, complicit in the sedition that caused Jesus' crucifixion. They were repeatedly arrested and abused, beaten, whipped, stoned, and crucified, yet they would not cease proclaiming the risen Jesus. Perhaps, Aslan concludes, the most obvious reason not to dismiss the disciples' resurrection experiences out of hand is that among all the other failed messiahs who came before and after him, Jesus alone is still referred to as a Messiah. I think we also need to remember when we grapple with the meaning of Easter that what Christians call Holy Week happened during the huge Jewish festival of Passover in Jerusalem. And Passover, as you know, is an ancient story of resistance, a celebration of the Israelites' liberation from slavery in the land of Egypt, the story of resistance to Pharaoh and the domination system that those people escaped. The followers of Jesus were also human beings seeking freedom from oppression, so that ancient story resounded in them. They followed a man who spent his 1-year brief public ministry resisting the unjust conditions he saw around him. And the early Jesus movement that eventually grew into Christianity was at root a movement of resistance. Author Robin Meyer wrote, "Who thinks of the church anymore as a defiant community, or faith itself as embodied resistance to the principalities and the powers? Whatever else may be said of the Jesus movement, it was born in opposition to the status quo. And now it largely sanctifies the status quo." Meyer challenges us by saying, the beloved community was born in resistance to the established order of death and indignity. It was concealed like leaven in the imperial loaf, germinating as a secret and subversive colony of heaven, a body of non-compliance. Now, he says, we are as compliant as the subjects of any empire, embracing what we are taught to value and resisting nothing that threatens our comfort, our success, our reputation, or our safety. Whew. And yet, I would say to Robin Meyer, we are still human beings who hear the call to liberation in our souls. Every year during the Passover Seders, people name the current oppressions of the day alongside the 10 plagues that descended upon Pharaoh. In a meditation about Passover called Desert Spring by Victoria Safford, she writes about the people who left Egypt. They had no idea where they were going when they left that night in the dark, without lights, without shoes, without bread. Their children smothered against them so they would make no noise. They went into the wilderness, and there they wandered 40 years. So in the springtime, we remember the promised land is not a destination, it's a way of going. The land beyond the Jordan, that country of freedom and dignity and laughter. You carry it with you inside you all the while. It is planted in your mind and heart already before you ever start out, before it even occurs to you that to leave that life in Egypt, that intolerable bondage of that life, what you need to do is get up and move forward. These old holy stories that we tell at this time of year are very human, and so are we. Like the disciples, we fall asleep when we want to stay awake for a friend. We are tempted by those in power when they try to buy our compliance. We fear the consequences of sticking our necks out for a cause we believe in. We fear retaliation if we make noise and let others know where we stand. And we, my dear ones, we humans grieve. When we lose a beloved, we struggle to make sense of their death. We sometimes have visions of our lost loved ones in our dreams or in our homes. We sometimes catch sight of them out of the corner of our eye. Did we really see them? Are they really gone? What do we believe? In a reading called The Humanist Speaks of Easter by Kendall Gibbons, she wrote, "There are only two things that we know for sure. One, they stashed Jesus' body in a tomb temporarily until they could get a chance to bury it properly. And when they came back, the tomb was empty. Make of that what you will. There are many possible explanations, some more likely than others. I don't believe that Jesus came back from the dead," she wrote. "Neither did Martin or Malcolm. Neither did Viola Luizzo or Frozen Safi, the women's rights activist shot by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Neither will dismembered journalist Jamal Khashoggi or Alexei Navalny when he dies in a Russian prison. Neither will documentary filmmaker Brent Renaud or photographer Maxim Levin, both killed by invading armies in Ukraine." She wrote, "I don't believe that the crucifixion is a story with a happy ending, or that it was a one-time event. It happens over and over as the human journey unfolds. It happens to us and to people we love. It happens to the righteous and the innocent. Crucifixion happens, and it feels like the end of the world every time. It feels like nothing could matter anymore, ever. And then, inevitably and miraculously, something happens next. Something happens. Of course it does, because the world hasn't ended yet. It's not always an empty tomb. Mostly the beloved bodies lie right there, peacefully decomposing. But something happens, and whether we want it or not, a new chapter begins. Maybe the sun comes up, or the lilies do. Spring rolls around, that happens. Or memories come, or someone needs you. You eat food, that happens. You walk down the road and share a reflection. Life happens, keeps happening. The dead don't rise, but we do. One day it happens, you take a breath, and it doesn't hurt to breathe. You start to see people again, really see them. Hope rises. Community rises. You rise. We rise. Life rises. Not because death isn't real. Crucifixion is not just pretend. But something else is just as real, maybe even more real. Something happens next. That is the other thing we know for sure. Life rises. Outrage rises. Love rises. Fate rises. Tears rise. Hope rises. This I do believe. Friends, when we tell the old holy stories at this time of year, we must remember that being human is part of the story. Being so utterly human is part of the story. Which story? The story of believing that love is stronger than death, that love lives on, the story of rising again. May it be so.